Well, let me begin the evening. My name is John Geer, and I'm co-director of the Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, which is a new center at Vanderbilt University, made possible with the generous help of folks like Nick Zeppos, Provost McCarty, Dean Dever, and also I co-directed with two of my colleagues, Dave Lewis and Josh Clinton, both of political science. The purpose of the center is really to try to have these kinds of discussions, these kinds of conversations with people who know a lot about politics and can bring that to the community, both with Vanderbilt and then the broader Nashville community as well. And the opportunity to be able to do this with my friend John and with the First Amendment Center is really a very special treat. And it's further made special by the fact that these two prominent journalists and their book on the 2008 election, which in my opinion continues the Teddy White tradition that started in 1960 and has gone forward. And this is just a great book that talks about a great election. It's the gift that kept giving and continues to give, and we'll have some evidence of that. I want to now turn over to John to make the formal introductions, and then we'll let Haynes and Dan talk about the elections. We'll also leave time for questions from the audience, as you might imagine.
Well, thank you, John. It's great to have you here with your colleagues, and it's a particular honor for me to have two journalists I consider to be the best informed political reporters I've known over a long period of time. Dan Balz is the chief political correspondent for the Washington Post. He has been their White House correspondent. He's been their lead political reporter, and when he writes or speaks about national politics, it is, in my judgment, about as close to the Bible as we're going to get, and we are in the buckle on, and we are in the buckle on the Bible belt as we sit here. Haynes Johnson, Pulitzer Prize winner. Together, they're a team. When I heard that they had come together to write this book, and John is said it quite well, if we are going to have Teddy White, 1960, the making of the president, for 2008, it's going to be the battle for America. And because of who Haynes has been and Dan has been and who they are, we're lucky to have them here. I don't really think much more formal introduction is really necessary. You're here to see two of the best reporters on politics that this country has had. And John, I don't know how you got them together to get them here, but everybody in this room's lucky that you did it.
Made Dan promise when we got together in the fall and held him to it.
Held me to it. No, we're happy to be here.
So I would just begin by taking us all back. I read the book, and it just reminded me how much I'd forgotten that was so important to us during that campaign year, which was much more than a year, of 2008. And just envision in your own mind's eye turning on that television set night after night after night, all those Republicans lined up for those debates, all those Democrats lined up for those debates. We knew there were going to be campaigners who dropped out, and they did, and they did, and they did, and finally on one side there were two, Barack and Hillary, and on the other there was just the one, unless you consider Governor Huckabee's candidacy serious, and I really never did. But that is to say how it turned out. What happened along the way is what, for me, is most exciting. I guess the best way to begin is take you back to that post-election interview you did with Barack Obama. He gave you an awful lot of time to spell out how he felt about what had happened and how he had succeeded. And just let me ask you about that moment, that interview, because it seems to me what he said that day, as we look back on it after this great fight over health care reform, I'm reminded he is who he said he was. He said his great hero was Abraham Lincoln. You knew it, but then he told you why. And tell us what he told you that day, because it seems to me it goes to the heart of what the book's about, what the campaign was about, and what this presidency is about.
I'm going to read a couple of passages, and we don't like to read things, but this was such a remarkable interview. It foreshadows who he is. He's 6 weeks before he's become president. He's president-elect. And it's in Chicago, and it is extemporaneous. It was taped, all off the cuff. Extremely thoughtful and revealing, not only for what he wanted to be, but what's happened in the years since then.
The interview was fascinating for a number of reasons. The first question that we threw at him was as follows. Before you were a politician, before you were who you are today, you were a storyteller. He'd written, obviously, this marvelous story, Dreams from My Father, the book about his own passage to adulthood. And so we said, how would you tell the story of you becoming president? And he paused for a minute and he said, I think the whole election was a novel. And then he said, and I don't think I was the most interesting character in it. And he started ticking off. He said there was, you had the first African American with a chance to be president. And you had the first woman with a serious chance to be president. And then he said, and then you had this aging. And he stopped and he said, strike that. He said, I don't want to offend John McCain. He said, you had this war hero. But then he said, you also had, you had Mike Huckabee, and he said, you had William Ayres, and you had Reverend Wright. And so he said, you had this amazing cast of characters. The last question in the interview, which was Haynes's idea, was, we said, Abraham Lincoln has certainly been a role model for you. Both came out of the Illinois legislature. You've talked about him a lot. In what ways is he a model for you, and why? And let me read you this answer, because if you, as John just said, if you think back about the Obama that we have seen as president, and the frustrations that some people who voted for him have expressed about his style of leadership, the way he has gone and operated, when you hear what he had to say, you will understand better why President Obama has operated the way he has. The first thing he said, by the way, was, look, I don't want anybody to think I am comparing myself to Lincoln. Basically saying, you asked the question, I didn't offer this. So he said, I'm not comparing myself to Lincoln. But then he said, what I admire so deeply about Lincoln, number one, I think he's the quintessential American because he's self-made. The way Alexander Hamilton was self-made, or so many of our great iconic Americans are. That sense that you don't accept limits, that you can shape your own destiny. He said, that obviously has appealed to me given where I came from. Then he said, but the second thing I admire most in Lincoln is that there is just a deep-rooted honesty and empathy to the man that allowed him to always be able to see the other person's point of view and always sought to find that truth that is in the gap between you and me. That the truth is out there somewhere, I don't fully possess it, and you don't fully possess it, and it is our job then to listen and learn and imagine enough to be able to get to that truth. He then went on, he said, if you look at his presidency, Lincoln never lost that. Most of our other great presidents, there was that sense of working the angles and bending other people to their will, FDR being the classic example. And Lincoln just found a way to shape public opinion and shape people around him and lead them and guide them without tricking them or bullying them, but just through the force of what I talked about, that way of helping to illuminate the truth. I find that to be a very compelling style of leadership. It's not one that I've mastered, but I think that's when leadership is at its best.
Yeah, if I could say, I don't know how many times we've gone back and reread that interview. as this year unfolded, with all the disappointments and frustrations that Obama faced in this year. And there's a poignancy to it. He wasn't able to bring together the differences in the country. They almost failed on health care. That's a whole other story in itself. But I think I have no question whatever, this is sincerely what he believes. This is his philosophical testament. And it turned out not to be the winning success of this last year. Healthcare is another exception. But I'd like to say one other thing. We're very glad to be here, number one, and we appreciate your coming out and these wonderful words that you said about us. But I want to explain why we tried to do this book. I first covered, I've been covering American politics since 1956, for God's sakes. I think sometimes I was around with Lincoln myself. And all these presidential campaigns, et cetera, et cetera. And when the election year was about 2 years before it was to begin, I began thinking about how we might approach this in terms of there was one thing that I was certain of, that this shaped up as being one of the most important elections in our lifetime as a country, for a lot of reasons, not just for the issues, the person. So many things were clashing ahead. And the second is that whoever was elected president out of this was going to face some of the most contentious issues since Franklin Roosevelt. Didn't matter. They were going to face these problems at home and abroad. So that was the background, and then I called Dan and said, can we have breakfast?
It's a funny story. Haynes called me, this was early in 2007, and he said, you know, I've got something I'd like to talk to you about. Can we get together? And I said, sure, why don't we have breakfast tomorrow morning? So I went home that night, and I said to my wife, Nancy, I said, well, Haynes called today, and he wants to get together to talk about something. And Nancy, who's very shrewd, said, well, if it's about a book, just say yes. And indeed, it was about a book, and Haynes laid out this idea for a big campaign book for the 2008 campaign, and he went through the ideas that he just laid out here. And he finished up, and I said, well, Haynes, it's ironic that you would come to me with this idea, because I said I'm literally two-thirds of the way through a proposal for a book about the 2008 campaign that is almost identical in concept, in scope, in ambition, in aspiration to what you're talking about. And so we decided at that point we would join forces and kind of divvied up the roles. I was sort of Mr. Inside because I was out on the trail every day for the Washington Post, and Haynes, who has done this throughout his career so brilliantly, was the person who would kind of provide a sense of where the country was. You know, where are Americans at this point? I mean, our great colleague David Broder has always said elections should not simply be about the candidates, they're about the voters in the country. And I've always thought that every presidential election is a snapshot of who we are as a country. It's not just about who the candidates are, it's what America collectively aspires to at that particular moment. And so our goal was to do a book that both captured the drama of the campaign and set it against the broader context of where America was in 2007 and 8.
When I think about where this book takes me, there are so many moments that the two of you get access to the candidates, which says something, I think, about political candidates knowing who the interviewers are. As we both know, in this era of partisan media, there is great suspicion on the part of many of the candidates. But you got access to whomever you wanted, and the story is enriched, I think, by anecdotes that personally involve you. We got access to everybody we wanted except one. Who was that?
Hillary Clinton.
Well, that's right.
We could not get Hillary Clinton to sit down for an interview for the book. I mean, we obviously covered her during the campaign, but
access to all of her aides and all the memoranda, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
And
that was one.
I know Hillary very well, but she never wanted to talk on the record for the book.
How much of that had to do with the outcome?
Well, John, that's a very good question, but she was reluctant even at the time when everybody thought she was going to be the nominee, and at that point it looked like it was going to be a good Democratic year. So, you know, she seemed to be on the path to the presidency, and even in that stage, she was standoffish. And her advisors claimed they were in favor of her sitting down with us to do the arrangement we had with candidates and staff was that in addition to the reporting that I was doing for the paper, we would do interviews for the book that would be embargoed until the book came out. And that was the basis on which we wanted to sit down with her and others.
Well, the reason I asked the question, and I assumed, wrongly obviously, but there is that scene in which she's sitting with her advisors, and it sounded to me as I read it as if it had come to you directly from her, but I take it was from advisors. She sits there with her advisors and says to them, now here she has said to everyone who was listening and watching, she has said again and again and again, he cannot win, he can't win, he won't win. And now she's considering, shall I stay in, shall I get out? And she asked the question, can he win? I thought that had come to you directly from her, but I take it came from
others in the room.
Others in the circle.
All in the room.
Yeah.
And only one says no.
Only one, Mark Penn.
Mark Penn says no, he can't win. Everybody else says yes, he can, and one person, I don't remember who, says yes, he can win, but with your support.
With your support, which was a crucial clause to add to that, because it, in a sense, forced Hillary Clinton to buy into that idea that not only was she not going to be the nominee, and he was, but that she would have to participate in making him president during the general election.
She was, as you all point out, a terrific campaigner.
Well, she didn't start out to be a good campaigner.
That's right.
It was only when she was losing and she was about to fall apart and the whole campaign was in disarray, she became a great candidate. Toward the end, she was fantastic. As Obama said, the more she went on, the better she got, even though they knew they weren't going to win. And that was one of the things about this book. We're not trying to, yeah, we are trying to sell the book, okay. Hell, you know. But
I would hope.
No, seriously, this was such a great story. Obama's right, it's a novel. You got all these characters. You got Obama from his background, where he's from, the idea of someone whose middle name is Hussein might be president of the United States, the first African American in history, etc. Then you got Hillary and Bill Clinton over here and the Kennedys and John McCain and frustrations and all this stuff. It was just a hell of a story to try to write about.
And Sarah Palin enriched the mix.
Well, that was the last gift.
That keeps on giving. I would describe Hillary Clinton's campaign slightly differently. I think that the way to think about her campaign and her candidacy was she performed best when it counted least, and she performed worst when it counted most, which is to say, in the earliest stage of the campaign in 2007, when Barack Obama was in fact floundering and struggling to get his own legs as a candidate, she was doing very well. As you got into that period in the late fall of 2007 and the Iowa caucuses, and then put New Hampshire aside for a minute, and then after New Hampshire in that South Carolina period and February, she and her team did not do what they needed to do. The Obama team outperformed them, and as candidates, Barack Obama outperformed her. Once Obama has racked up what is essentially an insurmountable lead in delegates by the end of February '08, she turns her candidacy around, and at that point...
And she herself did it. I mean, it was out of her. It wasn't the advisors. She took it on her own shoulders, and kind of amazing, even though that she knew she couldn't win. And it's one of these things that is surprising. And
in that long stretch where the race goes on from March to April, in through May, into the end of May and into June, and people are urging her to get out. You can't win, you should get out, do it for the good of the party. One of her people said to me, she could always understand the possibility that she would lose. She could never abide with the idea of quitting.
Yeah.
She was going to stay in that and fight it to the very end.
She's a fighter. Yeah.
One thing that in reading the book, you come away with a real appreciation for why campaigns matter. In fact, we were talking earlier that there's a political scientist at George Washington University, a guy named John Seigenthaler, a very well-respected guy, has given these fine gentlemen a bit of a hard time by overstating the importance of the campaign. I'm personally sympathetic to the idea that campaigns matter. But given all the various events that you witnessed, I mean, which is the one that stands out as mattering the most, I guess, would be the way to frame it. Now, that's an unfair question because there's probably 7 or 8 that you'd like to talk about, but what
well, I mean, I'll tell you the one that brought it home to me, and that was New Hampshire.
Yes.
You know, I remember landing in New Hampshire on that morning after the Iowa caucus at 5 in the morning or 4:30 in the morning. It's 0 degrees on the tarmac at the Manchester airport, and all of the candidates have, you know, flown overnight to get there to start out. And within 24 hours, it was just evident that Barack Obama was going to win that primary. I mean, everything you saw said to you, he is on a roll, and, you know, even though the Clintons had always had an affinity with New Hampshire, he was just riding a wave, and they were going to carry it through. And all of the superficial evidence told you that. And we wake up on, you know, election night, and suddenly she's the winner. And I realized as I went back the next day to sort of say, why didn't we see this? There were a couple of things. One is that she had recognized that New Hampshire voters are skeptical and finicky and like to do things independent-minded of what others have done. And what she realized, and all of us did not, was that there was a much larger pool of undecided voters in New Hampshire that weekend, despite the fact that the polls seemed to be moving toward Obama. She campaigned in a way that spoke to those voters, particularly women voters. And I think that the moment that she broke down and teared up at this diner in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, the day before the primary, in a sense sort of captured not just the emotion of her, but the emotion of a lot of people that this race should not end. And I think that the Obama campaign, if you talk to them afterwards, realized that they coasted through that whole 5 days, and she campaigned, and it made the difference.
You know, we haven't talked about John McCain and that side of it, and for me, reading the book, the puzzle that remains is what in the world was he thinking about when he selected Sarah Palin? Well, I mean, I hear you you all quote what various people said. Obama says, why did he do that?
Well, if you put yourself in John McCain's case, his own skin, it kind of makes sense. He's the fighter pilot, he takes risks, he flies off against enemies, and he doesn't expect to, he's going to dare all. And they knew they were losing, they were doomed after the Democratic convention. Obama had just soared off, and they knew they didn't have a prayer. And so they needed something, number one, to shake up the election. And they needed a woman if they could find it. It wasn't his first choice. He didn't know Sarah Palin. And here came this woman from Alaska that they looked about and found about, and she was from the frontier, and she was charming and this and that. She'd fought against her own party, and they meet each other very briefly. And then that was it. And he flies off, and by God, what people forget, she actually did transform the election from being losing and then for a couple of weeks, John McCain was ahead in the polls up until Sarah's went on television to be interviewed. and then the economy crashed. But it really is very interesting to look back on that.
There is a wonderful moment that takes place the morning that McCain offers Sarah Palin the vice presidency. He's in Sedona at his quote-unquote cabin, and she is on her way from Flagstaff, being secretly driven to meet him.
You all described that secret trip so well, I'll tell you.
It was a fun couple of days. But while she's making the trip, he's on the phone with A.B. Culverhouse, who was the lawyer in Washington who was in charge of the vice presidential selection process. And Culverhouse had had a long telephone interview with Sarah Palin the night before when she got to Arizona, the final stage of the vetting process that they put her through. Very hasty, some people think very superficial, but he's giving McCain a readout. And so he describes the interview and basically is pretty positive. And McCain says, bottom line, AB, give me the bottom line. And Culverhouse says, John, high risk, high reward. And McCain says, AB, you shouldn't have told me that. I've been taking risks all my life.
That's who he was.
He was prepared to do it.
You asked another question about what was important in this campaign. I mean, I think, to me, the Obama interview, what he says there, the McCain stuff with Sarah Palin, but the idea of the private clash between the Clintons and Kennedy for the endorsement. They have particularly a series of very animated, angry telephone calls, not just one call, a series of them, between Bill Clinton, particularly, not Hillary, Bill and Ted Kennedy, they wanted desperately to have Bill Clinton endorse Hillary. And those conversations back and forth, and Bill fuming and Kennedy sort of saying, you know, this and that. And it was an incredible sort of episode. It went on. And it was decisive. When in the end, when Ted Kennedy endorsed her, that was it.
You know, as you point out, Bill Clinton thought he was entitled to that endorsement.
Yes.
He had named Kennedy's sister Jean ambassador to Ireland.
Right.
And that's just one of many
Yeah.
acts he'd taken to please Ted Kennedy during his own administration. And I'm sure the disappointment was intensified once he understands I'm entitled to it, but I'm not going to get it.
And bubbling up there was the question of race and how well Clinton had handled the question of race, and Clinton's own fury about I'm being accused of being a racist and so forth, and I've done all these things in my career, my life, and so forth. So it was an extraordinary series of conversations that went on and on.
The irony of this is that nobody in the Clinton campaign wanted to contest South Carolina seriously. I mean, they knew she had to be on the ballot. There was going to be a debate down there. But they saw right after Iowa that the African-American vote had moved dramatically and decisively to Obama. Once an all-white state ratified his candidacy, African-Americans who had been wary about this and had been pretty divided between Hillary Clinton and Obama moved decisively. Everybody in the Clinton campaign knew that. They knew they were going to lose South Carolina. They didn't want to play there. Bill Clinton was the one powerful voice who said, we can do better than people think there. I can go and help. And he spent much more time in South Carolina than his wife did, to her ultimate detriment. Because two things. One is it came at this moment when people in the African-American community, Congressman Jim Clyburn being the most prominent, felt that Bill Clinton was doing things to inject race in a destructive way into the campaign, trying to paint Obama simply as a black candidate, another Jesse Jackson. But it also increased the stakes of South Carolina, so that when Obama won that by 27 points or whatever it was, it gave him a lift and a buoyancy and a momentum that he wouldn't have had if Hillary Clinton had not contested the state. And so the Obama people felt that the combination of South Carolina and the Kennedy endorsement, which came back to back, turned the campaign decisively in their direction.
Let me ask a hypothetical. You make reference to the fact that Hillary Clinton knew that Iowa was not prime territory for her. In fact, there was some discussion about pulling out, and then that memo was leaked that discussed the possibility of pulling out, and that basically forced Clinton to stay in Iowa, invest a huge amount of resources, et cetera. And you know, it's asking you to guess, but you guys were on the ground, so to speak, and have a better feel for it. I mean, if that had actually been a strategy they'd pursued and pulled out of Iowa and put all their marbles in New Hampshire, save their money, would this have been? Would we have had a different outcome? I mean, that's.
I think maybe, I don't know, but I do think the South Carolina thing, to go back to what Dan said, they did want to pull out of South Carolina. They're going to lose it now. They've lost. They lost Iowa, and now it's up for grabs. And they wanted to just make a token and leave it. And they didn't do that. I think that was more critical to me.
You think it was more critical than Iowa?
I do, because it came after the whole thing was falling apart, and I think that was a strategic, tragic.
Although I think if this campaign had started in any other state, she very well would have been the nominee. Now, I think that the problem with the hypothetical is that there's no way that if you are the front runner and the dominant front runner at the beginning that you can say, I'm going to duck an event.
Right.
I mean, if she had had the courage of her conviction or of her deputy campaign manager's conviction to do that, you know, it might well have been a different outcome, because the Obama victory would not have carried as much weight. There's no question about that. But, you know, there's another, we do a number of these sort of what Churchill called the terrible what ifs.
What ifs of history.
You know, what ifs of history. And one of them is, what if Florida had in fact been a real event?
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, as you know, Florida was declared a non-event because they broke the rules and moved the date of their primary earlier than the DNC authorized. David Plouffe said there was a conference at Harvard after the election.
David Plouffe being the campaign manager
for Obama, said that if Florida had been a real event, Hillary probably would have been the nominee and president.
Let me ask a question about money, because it seems to me money, as we know, is mother's milk of politics, or father's milk of politics. Interesting to me that McCain has a bankroll and blows it and is infuriated with his staff because of it. I mean, we looked for John McCain to lose his temper during the campaign, and we never saw it. That doesn't mean he didn't lose his temper. Yes. He damn well did when he got back to the staff on how they'd blown that money. That's one side of it. The other surprising thing to me was to be reminded, as you all say, that the money came in for Obama early and big. And I never have really understood how he managed to get that bankroll. I remember Bill Clinton blowing up, and a couple of advisors on whom he was counting were giving money to Obama. But talk a little bit about money in the campaign and how much difference it made in this campaign.
Well, it certainly made a difference, obviously. And when Clinton, they started out with these great advantages. They had all the money, they had all the experts, they had all that. And then the campaign begins to implode. McCain, you talked about, McCain had a huge bankroll. And then, by God, for a couple of months, the whole thing is broken. And one of the scenes that we try to describe in this is McCain is a loser now. And he's going back to New Hampshire. He flies up there on a commercial plane, carrying his own bag, just by himself, maybe with one aide with him. And the idea that, you know, so that it wasn't, the mismanagement made a huge difference on both parts of that. But there's also something else. The people will be studying in this room and elsewhere how the Obama people put together their grassroots movement. And they understood the politics of it. They understood how to get it. And Obama tapped into something in the country. And people were enthusiastic about him, and you could say overly so, and naively so, and you know. But he did, and there was an emotion there that was lacking for Hillary and lacking for McCain.
Yeah, I mean, I think there were a couple of elements that contributed to his fundraising success, which was really what kept him in the game for the first 6 months, because the rest of his candidacy was, as I said earlier, a little shaky. One was Hillary Clinton's vote for the war resolution in 2002, and his speech when he was a novice candidate for the U.S. Senate at the same time, opposing the war. That opened up for him. I mean, that was the clearest difference between two people who otherwise were pretty much aligned on policy matters. That created an opening to him, for him to the Democratic base, the anti-war base, the liberal activists, the people who were angriest at Bush. who had gotten behind Howard Dean, and he was able to raise a lot of money on it. So that was one thing. And I think the other, which Haynes alluded to, was this message of hope, change, turn the page on what we've been through, was in the early stage, if not an explicit, an implicit contrast with the Clintons. But it also had a resonance with a lot of people who weren't necessarily activists, but who were looking at the way politics was being practiced and were sick of it. And they thought, okay, this is something new. And as Haynes said, they figured out a way to tap into that, not just through traditional ways of, $2,300 maximum contributions, but online. And ultimately, they raised almost $500 million online, which is extraordinary.
John, you ask another question, and then we'll enlarge the conversation to the whole room.
Well, partly to anticipate some of the questions, I mean, with the landscape of 2008 now in the background, and obviously now healthcare, speculate a little bit about this coming November.
Well, obviously, it's all people are writing about in politics right now, and the projections are it's going to be a disaster for the Democrats. They're going to lose the House, lose the Senate, so forth. I think it is very, very premature to make any predictions about where we are. The key is going to be, how do Americans feel about their country and their economy? And it's going to be on that basis that I think this election will be based. The Democrats are certainly going to lose seats. That's the norm measure. How much? I don't trust any polls at this point, surveys, and there are many, many of them. But the question is, yes, they could lose the House. Reagan was in bad. He was down to 42% in the polls in his first year. Don't forget. And Bill Clinton lost the House and Senate for the first time in 40 years, and yet came back to win re-election victories. So I think too much is being put on the idea that everything is banked on 2010. Now, it is crucially important for the Democrats, and the fact that they escaped the death knell by passing health care. Had they not done that, the Democrats, I think they would have been in major, major, major trouble. But I think it's changed now.
I would say there are, among a number of things to keep our eyes on, there are two keys. One is through most of the latter part of 2009 and into the early part of 2010, everything we've seen, both in polling and anecdotally, says that the Republican base is far more energized than the Democratic base.
Absolutely.
And in midterm elections, that counts a lot. The question is whether the passage of health care and whatever else may come after that will revive the Democratic base, which has clearly been, lethargic, somewhat disillusioned, worried, whether that will firm up the Democratic base in a way that begins to match it. The second is what happens with the independent voters who moved so decisively in 2006 and 2008 to the Democrats, and then in Virginia, New Jersey, and the Scott Brown election in Massachusetts, moved decisively to the Republican Party.
And that's the key.
If the Democrats can't get those voters back, then it'll be a very tough year.
Yeah.
We're going to try to make a record of this, and so if you have a question, we have a mic here, and I'm not going to pass it around, but you all can pass it around among yourselves. And there's a question right back there. Will you come get it?
Yes.
And that way you let an old man sit down. Haynes said that he was not there when Lincoln was. He was. I remember I was just a boy at the time.
All right. Well, my question is, Mitt Romney, who came yesterday, appears to be talked about a lot for the 2012 elections. What went wrong with his campaign? What do you think was what were the factors, based on your analysis of the election in 2008, that gave him trouble and ultimately led to his loss against Romney?
I think Governor Romney could not figure out who he was and who he wanted to be as a candidate. He had a record in Massachusetts, obviously a very liberal state. He had run twice in Massachusetts, once unsuccessfully for Senate against Ted Kennedy and once successfully for governor. And in those campaigns had taken a position pro-choice on abortion, said he would do more for gay rights than Ted Kennedy in his 1994 race, and woke up as he started to look toward 2008 and realized that he needed to, or he felt he needed to shift his positions. In doing that, he created a question about what he really believed. And some conservative Republicans never believed him, and moderate Republicans, which is clearly a shrinking core of the Republican Party, felt betrayed. And I don't think he ever figured out how to work himself out of that issue. I mean, there were people in the campaign and people outside the campaign who he consulted before the campaign started, who said essentially, you should run as who you are, which is to say, a successful executive, somebody who has a record of being able to manage organizations, fix problems, deal with things in a not purely ideological way. And as it turned out, he would have been perhaps a more effective candidate had he stuck to that message, and particularly the economy.
Yeah, right.
Because as the economy went south, he began to talk about that in a fairly credible way. But by then, the damage was done, and I think that it sealed his fate.
He had more credibility on the economy than anybody.
My colleague, Gene Policinski, Vice President of the Freedom Forum and Executive Director of the First Amendment Center, has come to my rescue, and he has the microphone.
And we have a question here. I'm going to defer me for a moment. I do have a question, but I'm going to let this gentleman ask his question.
Thank you. Hello. I'm not too. I'd like to know. Can you provide your insight onto the ramifications of the Supreme Court case, Citizens United, on what this might, what will happen for the midterm elections if you think any profound effect will happen because of it?
The Supreme Court is obviously, it always is and always has been. And, when Obama gave the State of the Union address, you all watched it, I'm sure. And Obama's standing there looking out over the whole country. And there our Supreme Court is gathered in front of him. And I don't know in our history whether a president of the United States has ever so directly challenged the court.
Certainly not sent court packing by FDR.
Yeah, well, but FDR did it by not that way, not face to face in a way.
Confrontation, no.
And I think that was an extraordinary moment, and it shows how charged this thing is. And so it's not going to be the dominant issue of 2010. That's going to be health care and the economy first. And how does health care, does it seem to work or not work? We don't know. But it's going to be the economy. It's not going to be the Supreme Court.
I think that, that decision certainly has the potential to flood more money into an already flooded system.
That's right.
And I think what we don't know is how aggressive corporations and unions will be in doing what they're now going to be able to do. It is possible that they could, one side or the other, could target a handful of House members, for example, and pour money into those races in an effort to defeat them. But we don't know yet what that's going to look like. But it certainly has the potential to be a significant change in the way money flows.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a very important decision. It affects all of politics and will for years if it stands as such and transform things. But I don't think, well, anyhow, we've said.
I had the privilege over Christmas reading David Plouffe's book, The Audacity to Win, and what struck me about it was the unbelievable discipline that the Obama campaign had. And I'm curious, from your inside perspective, was there really that level of discipline and coordination at the campaign level?
Yeah, I believe there was. Don't you think so, Dan? I mean, they had much more discipline. Certainly, compared to the Clinton campaign was so disorganized and fractious and fighting back and forth. And McCain's campaign was all this back and forth. And the Obama campaign people really did keep much more discipline among their folks. And you were traveling with them every day.
We always have a tendency to describe winning campaigns as perhaps more effective than they actually were at any given moment in the campaign, and losing campaigns as being in total disarray all of the time. So there's a kind of an exaggeration that goes on. But I think that David Plouffe is right in that. There were a couple of elements that I would cite. One is this was a campaign that was collegial. All campaigns have arguments, and they ought to. I mean, at any given moment, they have to make decisions under great pressure, and not everybody agrees, and they have those arguments. But this was a campaign in which people respected each other. Right. Obama, this idea, no drama Obama, that he set forth, came from him at the very beginning, and they abided by that. The other thing that was important was they not only respected one another, but they stayed out of each other's way. I mean, in any campaign, people have particular responsibilities. And a good campaign is one in which, if you're in charge of the field operation, you're not telling the person in charge of advertising what they ought to be doing. And in bad campaigns, everybody's, kibitzing on everybody else's turf. And the Obama campaign was effective at that. And the third was they had a capability beyond any of the other campaigns at sort of looking over the horizon and doing their planning and sticking to the plan. I remember a conversation I had in September of '07 with Steve Hildebrand, who was the deputy campaign manager at the time. And he talked to me about a delegate strategy and the fact that this nomination battle might in fact turn into a battle for delegates. Unheard of. I mean, we have never covered a race in modern times in which it really mattered what the delegate count was, because it was a campaign of momentum, and people won a few big states and that was it.
The horse race.
The horse race. Yeah. And they were preparing for the idea that after the first 4 early contests, there would not be a definitive front runner, and they were putting in place the organization, the operation, and the strategy to fight for delegates. And in the end, that, more than anything else, may have, in a tactical sense, may have been the decisive factor in why they were able to defeat Hillary Clinton.
And the brilliance of that strategy was so Hillary Clinton, no Democratic candidate in past history, if you win New York, California, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, these big states and so forth, you're going to get the nomination. She won those states, Texas too. But it was this strategy, understanding the arithmetic and the delegates and how you can divine it, and shockingly, from the standpoint of politics, the Clinton people never got it.
Let me do one more thing on this, because it's so illustrative. On Super Tuesday, among all of the states at play, there's New Jersey on the one hand and Idaho on the other. New Jersey had 107 delegates that they were awarding that day. Idaho had 18. Hillary Clinton won New Jersey fairly easily. She netted 11 more delegates than Obama from that 107. Obama, because it was a caucus state where he worked hard and she ignored, netted 12 more delegates than Hillary out of the 18. So out of those 2 states, he actually came out one
ahead, as you all
even though she had won the state with all the delegates.
Campaigns do count.
They do.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you talk about this, because this actually leads right to my question. Speaking as I worked at the RNC during the primary in 2007, and you could tell that the parties really don't have any power when it comes to these campaigns. We would send a press release, and one campaign would call us and say, "Why are you sending this? This is exactly the opposite of what my candidate says," or whatever. And so the parties really don't have much power. And what you guys are talking about with the DNC having placed a deadline in Florida, kind of ignoring it and holding their primary anyway, you contrast that with so much emphasis on Iowa and New Hampshire and South Carolina being so pivotal in a campaign.
And Idaho, we just said.
And Idaho, and
you
look at the Republican primary, Mitt Romney placed so much of his emphasis on Iowa, ended up coming up short, and it really hindered his campaign. Is too much emphasis being placed on these early states? Is there any potential of having some kind of a national influence on this more than just party operations? Because really, you look at the delegates in the DNC, and it was such a race for super delegates and everything else. The Republicans have a completely different process, and it was very convoluted. And the nation is at stake for some of these things, and sometimes some of these campaigns can not necessarily place so much emphasis on an early state and actually be a better campaign or a better candidate. So my question is, do you see out of this process any potential for reform of some of these things, where we have regional primaries or having kind of a national government influence in it, maybe more so than just a party versus party process?
Well, we address that question toward the end of the book when we're trying to draw the lessons. And in fact, we have a disagreement on this. I have favored for years regional primaries, maybe 4 or 5, and so you eliminate the little state, but they're all together. You have the Northeast and so forth, and that way you have a larger consensus. And Dan likes the present system, I think, am I fair to say it?
With a couple of modifications.
But the fact is, clearly, we ought to examine the way we have these things, and I don't know that it never seems to happen. It keeps coming back and back and back, and we're in the same old thing. But go ahead, Dan.
I think this is a system that needs reform in part because it starts too early, and if it doesn't go properly, is over too quickly before the country really has a chance to wake up and see what's going on. The reason I don't like the idea of the regional primaries is because I think it enhances even more the advantages of a candidate with big name and celebrity and a lot of money. And from spending as much time as I've spent over the years in Iowa and New Hampshire in particular, the value of forcing candidates to talk face-to-face with real voters should not be underestimated. And if you create a system only of regional primaries, it would alleviate the need for them to do that. And I've seen candidates changed by that process. I've seen them grow through that process. And I have watched candidates gain a much better understanding of what's really on the minds of people. I don't by any stretch of the imagination think that Iowa or New Hampshire are representative of anything other than their own 2 small geographic areas. But there is a sort of seriousness to the politicking that goes on there that I think has value.
This is the only thing we don't agree on.
Gene, you have a question.
I do, thank you. I had some experience in covering campaigns starting in '68 and going actively through '84, and I'm just curious. It's always dangerous to ask somebody publicly to pursue your pet theory, but unlike any other campaign that I was involved in coverage of, and really subsequently, this one never seems to have ended. I mean, would you say that's an observation, unlike a lot of other campaigns where there was an interval, there was a moment when the candidate went away or the candidate withdrew from, the sort of public contest, and it doesn't seem to have ended. Palin is out there campaigning almost nonstop. McCain is leading charges here and there. I mean, it seems unlike it.
Romney's here.
He was here yesterday.
Selling books and campaigning.
Well, no, it hasn't ended, and we're in the perpetual campaign mode and so forth. And because things are so polarized, number one, and the stakes are so great, and they really are great for the country, not just for the politicians or the president. They're enormous stakes, and so there's a lot of tension, a lot of anger, a lot of frustration in the country, and therefore the way we express that is through politics. And the campaigns go on, and you have strategists and poll makers and money coming in, and that's part of where we are. Now, you haven't asked, well, that's how.
Someone said of the campaign itself, this was a marathon run at the pace of a sprint, which is to say there was not a day of let up from the time people got in January of '07 to the time of the election. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, as we've gone around to talk about this book, it's been fascinating how much people are still attached to this campaign. This campaign clearly engaged people in a way that no campaign that I've covered, or I think Haynes has covered, maybe with the exception of a couple, just captured people's imagination and interest, and people followed it. I mean, we saw evidence of that. And I think coming out of that, people want to know how this story is going to end. And there is still a fascination of what happened in 2008? What did it really mean? Did we have a different country as a result of 2008?
Were we wrong? Did we make
and where are we going as a result of it? And because the jury is still out on that, I think people are still following this campaign and its aftermath.
Can I say, add one thing before another question? We really haven't talked about the role of the media in this case. And I'm surprised we haven't gotten a question about that. But what you've got now is because of the cable talking, you got 2 every night. Here's Fox and here's MSNBC, and people are watching only that and only that. And trying to fill the middle ground becomes increasingly more difficult, and so people are being formed their opinions through the vehicle of those factors. It didn't used to be in the old days you had this division within politics. It makes it more difficult, and it makes it more important for the people to pay attention to sources of information they can trust. And I don't know how you quantify that one.
Since you disagreed with each other on that question of reform around the primaries, how about if we push that forward to the general election and see if you disagree also? The Electoral College as a way of selecting our president, is that something that should be scrapped? And before you answer, I'll remind you you're sitting in a state where there really was no general presidential election.
I don't know. What do you think, Dan? I don't know. I don't think it should be
I don't have a
scrapped.
firm opinion on that. I mean, I think that, you know, you could argue that if you went simply to the popular vote, you know, you would create a different version of what we have now, which is to say targeted areas. You know, if you were a Democratic nominee, you would do everything you possibly could to roll up the vote in New York and California and a couple of other big states. And if you were a Republican, you would spend even more time in Texas, some of the other red states with sizable populations. So, you know, because of what happened in 2000, this is obviously an issue. But I don't know that eliminating that. I'm not prepared to say we ought to eliminate the Electoral College.
We ought to look at it very carefully.
Now there's a non-committal answer.
Well, if Al Gore were here, you know he'd have something to say about that.
You want to hear a funny story? In 2000, as I was shuttling back and forth between Nashville and Austin, I had a conversation with a Gore campaign official, and we were going through the states. And we got to West Virginia, and I said, it looks as though you guys have slipped in West Virginia. And he said, yeah, you know, he said, we were doing fine there, and we just kind of pulled out because we thought we were doing all right, and it's gotten away from us. But he said, you know, fortunately, it's only 5 electoral votes.
That's a great anecdote.
Your mention of money and of the media actually turned me into a new question. This was the first presidential primary I can remember when I heard somebody running for the office of the presidency of the United States referred to as a brand, as if Hillary Clinton did something, and on the news someone said that, well, the Clinton brand was hurt by this, and I thought, this is somebody running for perhaps the most powerful position in the world, as if she were someone aspiring to the status of cornflakes, and I am sort of bothered by that, and I wonder if the media it plays a part in sort of turning this into, it is salesmanship, of course, you're just selling candidates, but at what point does the money involved and the sort of commercialization of a president as brand become problematic to you, or does it?
Well, I think that's an old question, and it is true that people look at the brand of whatever the candidate may be and so forth. And I do also, as I said, I think the question of the media is a really serious one to be looked at. How do we cover it? We are caught up in the horse race too much. It's not a new phenomenon. It's not a new thing. That's why you rely on people like Dan Balz, who's out there every day on the trail writing pieces. And I mean, not just to flatter Dan, that's what he does. And you can rely on it. And all you can do is make your judgment on what is the source of information you're getting, and do you find it credible or not. And that's hard work, not for the reporters or for the politicians, for the people, to look at the sources of information they have. What can you count upon? That's all you got is your good name and reputation. And if you're going to make mistakes on everything you write, everything you report, but if you're just caught up in the sweep of the place to place, I think it doesn't do a service for the country.
I got one question. As far as I remember, there was in the press reports that Hillary Clinton did run out of money, but was deeply in debt. And then there were meetings, and Obama should come up with $30 million in order to get her endorsement.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite follow the question.
I didn't either.
Okay, that there were press reports that Hillary Clinton did run out of money.
Right.
And was all of a sudden big in debts. And then there were meetings when Obama should come up with, I think, $30 million in order to get her endorsement.
Well, the reality is that he offered, as all winning candidates do, to try to help her retire her debt. But even in the week of the Democratic convention, when we were out in Denver, in talking to some of the Clinton team, their feeling was the Obama campaign had hardly lifted a finger to do that. So they helped a little bit, but not nearly to the extent that she had hoped. And there was some bitterness and animosity between the two camps as a result of that.
Yeah, and the bitterness and animosity is particularly interesting now. He picks her as Secretary of State. They're working very well together. It's an interesting phenomenon that those campaigns go on, but a change occurred. But there was real bitterness over that, as Dan says.
You asked about the media. I was wondering if you think the media should have covered the Edwards campaign differently, that it basically got treated as credible until he lost, and then we find out afterwards that things were a lot different.
Should we have covered Edwards' campaign differently?
Yeah, just in general.
Well, he certainly did himself in. We talked about this earlier. The National Enquirer, the Scandal magazine, breaks the story about John Edwards' affair with his mistress, whatever you want to say, and nobody really picked it up. And because they were a Scandal magazine and so forth, and now it looks terrible, and all I can say, and this is a personal, thank God he wasn't President of the United States. I mean, it would have been a disaster for that scandal would have come out had he got the nomination or had he been president. So should we have covered it differently? He got enormous coverage, and from the beginning, it didn't cover that aspect of it.
I think that, I mean, here's a sort of the dirty little secret of things. If John Edwards had been seen as a likely nominee, I think the coverage would have been different. As the Enquirer story that Haynes referred to was published in October of 2007, the first story, much vaguer than their later stories. But the National Enquirer was right about John Edwards all the way through. But at that time, even though he was credible in Iowa and certainly a factor in Iowa, there were very few people, whether it was in the media or in the other campaigns, who thought John Edwards had any real chance of becoming the nominee, that it was either going to be Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton. But let's say he had won Iowa. I think it is entirely possible that the level of scrutiny would have ramped up considerably, and that people would have begun to look at those things in a much more serious way. So in that sense, it is a failing on our part. The reality is there's only so much even the mass of media can cover at any one time, and the resources to do something like that, are significant. And so, as I say, as you kind of go up the ladder of credibility, the level of scrutiny accompanies it.
And there's one other factor on that. No need to sort of point it out, but Elizabeth Edwards had a second case of cancer, was recovering from it. There was a great deal of sympathy for her, I'm not saying, and this tragedy overcame other things, so it became more complicated.
We're all there is between you and your right, First Amendment right to free glass of wine, and so we'll take two more questions. And those of you who haven't been to the bathroom here, you may not have to go, but there's a wonderful opportunity to get a laugh. Some of you I see nodding, you've been there and you've laughed. I might even get 2 or 3 laughs by going to the bathroom, and I won't say any more about it, but let's have 2 more questions, and then we'll have a glass of wine, and...
May I be excused?
And they're going to be books outside, and Dan and Haynes will be there to sign them for you. But 2 more questions.
I feel I should come up with another question, John, to ask you to tell us more about the bathrooms, but I'll defer that. I want to ask our guests to share with us what they learned about race in America from covering this campaign, beyond the momentousness of this event, the first African American.
Yeah, well, let me try to address that. I've spent most of my life as a journalist writing about race, from Selma and Birmingham and all the rest. And John, when I first met you, was in that period a long time ago. And whatever happens to Barack Obama's presidency, if it's seen as a failure, he's defeated and so forth, the election of an African American candidate is one of the great moments in American history. It was a defining moment, the fact that people and overwhelmingly came to, and I think you ask a question, what do you remember? I remember that night in Chicago when he'd won, and the looking at those pictures of the faces in the crowds, and they were not all just lifelong Obama supporters and so forth. We went back and talked to people we've been covering in the campaign. There was who had voted against Obama, didn't think he had the talents or the expertise or whatever, but there was a sense of pride that the country had stepped across a terrible barrier that had existed for our entire history of this country. So I think that race, it's still there. It doesn't mean that his election sort of banished racial prejudice and hatred. Obviously not. You see it bubbling up again. But it was an incredibly important moment for this country. We crossed a barrier we hadn't crossed for a long time in our history.
When we talked to Barack Obama about this, his view was that certainly this was not a campaign that was going to eliminate racism or racial politics in America. But he said he was always confident that for every person who was going to vote against him because he was African American, there was likely to be another person who was going to vote for him because he was African American. Whether that was a surge in turnout as we saw in the African American community, or white voters who wanted to help break that barrier. Their view in the campaign was that this would, in the end, be something of a wash. Now, there's been some effort since then by the political science community to try to take a look more seriously at whether there was the so-called Bradley effect, which is to say that that Obama should have won by even more, but didn't because he's African American. I've not yet seen anything conclusive about that, but it does seem to me that the Obama campaign, which looked at this very, very carefully and closely throughout the campaign, they didn't make a lot out of it, but they did pay attention, was always confident that in the end, this country had reached a point where it was ready to break that barrier if he could meet all the other tests.
John, you want to add to that as a political scientist?
Well, I mean, political science has struggled with race for a long, long time, and we know that it matters, and the washing out effect, I think, is quite likely. Lots of people are looking at it. I mean, part of what's gone on over the last 40 years, there's a book by a woman named Talia Mendelberg that makes a case about the race card you probably know about. It's basically went implicit rather than explicit, where obviously George Wallace was hardly subtle. But you know, it comes up, and we here in Tennessee saw it 4 years ago. And so that it plays out in lots of different ways. But I haven't seen anything that would suggest to me that, at least in political science literature, that was an effect. And you know, we like to estimate things. It was a 2 percentage point shift in the vote or whatever. That's what kind of things political science will do. I haven't seen anything that's convincing on that front.
The other thing that President Obama said about this was that the most perilous moment of the campaign for him was when the Reverend Wright tapes first came out. And he said he believes that if he had not handled that in the way he did, it might well have cost him the election.
Last question is yours.
Well, it's, I guess, media related, so maybe a good way to wrap it up. It's also sort of process related. I wondered if you might talk a little bit about how you go about developing this kind of book. That is to say, do you look at it as long-form journalism, or do you look at it as literature? And what about your competitors, like I think Halpern's book, right? The other one. It seems like it gets a few days of intense media coverage where they focus on the sort of the sexy elements of it, and then it sort of drifts away from the discussion, from the national discourse. Whereas when you think about White's book and you think about Timothy Krause, people who wrote these sort of works of literature,
well, let me try to answer your question.
Sure.
I don't say I would like to be thought of as literature, but that's not it. We were trying to tell a story in a narrative form about a great and important moment for the country. And that was the whole idea of trying to do this through as much as we could find out, through the lens of the people involved, the stories that were evolving, the conflicts that emerged, but it's a story, it's a narrative story. Thucydides, the Peloponnesian Wars, it's a narrative. I mean, Teddy White was a narrative of that presidential campaign. That was what we were trying to do here. Call it literature, gee, if you want to, it'd be nice, but it's a story. You tell it as well as you can, as imperfectly as it is.
The comparison between our book and Game Change, Mark and John are friends, and I admire their work a lot. And having plowed a lot of that same ground, they dug deeper in some areas than we did. Put aside the scandal stuff. We decided John Edwards was not a main character in our book, and so we didn't spend time reporting that. There is one, I think, big difference in the way we sort of approached this from the beginning and the way I think they did, and readers will determine which they like better. What we wanted to do as much as possible was have a contemporaneous account of what people were thinking, which is why a lot of the interviews done for the book were done with the idea of we will not reveal this information until the campaign is over, in order to try to get as much as possible a kind of a candid view as events are unfolding or immediately after an event. And we wanted to get as much of that on the record as we could. Mark and John's approach was to go do deep background and do a lot more. They had more time to do a lot more post-game interviewing when people are more willing to talk about certain things and to certainly do it if they know they're not going to be identified as the source of it. So you have, in a sense, two different approaches to the books, telling in many ways a similar story, but with a different idea of how to get there. And so, as I say, some people will say they like the Game Change, which is sexy and and revelatory.
It's a very good book.
Yeah,
and it's fun to read.
Yeah,
that's right.
And it was. It's not the book we wrote, and I don't want to criticize them at all. I believe my background was journalism, but also graduate work in American history. I always wanted to write. Came to Washington all those years ago because I also wanted to write books. And that was the whole thrust of these things, and narrative stories, and now, by God, there have been 16 of them. And no, but I mean, and the idea, and I remember when Bob Woodward was doing the Watergate stuff, and his first book, All the President's Men, came out, and I was very critical of Bob to his face, and also in print and supervising and so forth, that he would write in a fictional way, as if you're in the head of the person you're describing. And they do that in the Game Change also. It's all, and I just don't agree with that. I think you can't pretend to be a fictional writer writing nonfiction. And if someone says they remembered it, say that. If they heard it from somebody else, say that, and also document it. I mean, it might be sexy, but that's what I believe we tried to do. And whether we failed or not, I don't know. Theirs is a hell of a good book. It's a good
and I will say, I think it's a very well-reported book.
Yes, it is.
I think they
absolutely.
did very deep reporting.
And I enjoyed reading it. And when it came out about a year after ours did, something like that.
As I look at this audience that you've drawn here, it is a real cross-section of the community. There are political leaders here. There are academics here. There are journalists here. I am not, for a moment, going to single anybody. I guess I should single out the first woman to be elected to statewide office in Tennessee. Jane Eskin is here, but if I go beyond that, I'll never end. And so I will say to all of you, thank you so much for coming, and I ask you to join John and me in giving our distinguished guests So there's wine outside, and there are books outside, and there are bathrooms outside. We're adjourned.
The bathroom thing sounds intriguing.
Thank you all. You've been a great audience.